The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. Hope you've been enjoying the episodes that we put together for you so far this year. And again, if you're enjoying the show or if you appreciate it, if it's encouragement to you at any level, please do me a favor if you could rate it and maybe even leave a review. That allows other people who are looking for content like this to find it. It allows the algorithms to bend in our favor. So recently I had the opportunity to go on a spiritual formation retreat, and the theme for the weekend was forgiveness. And the facilitators of that retreat asked us to consider the following passage. So we read it alone, we discussed it in small groups, and then we discussed it in a larger group. And there's some really, really beautiful insights about forgiveness in this passage. It resonated with me specifically because my word for the year is mercy. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus answered, "I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. So we'll pause there for a moment. I love the fact that Peter is saying, "Hey, Jesus, there's a person who keeps hurting me. Like they keep offending me. They keep wounding me. How many times do I have to put up with this?" And a friend of mine once said in Jewish tradition, the magic number was 3. You should forgive them 3 times. And Peter, who is ever the zealous and overachieving student, says, "Well, what if I double that and add 1? How about 7? And Jesus is saying, Peter, forgiveness is not a journey that gets measured in addition. It's one that gets explored in multiplication. And I love the fact that Jesus is saying, Peter, forgiveness always takes more energy and often lasts longer than you'll want it to. And when I read this passage, I'm reminded that forgiveness is both a moment and a journey. It is both a decision and a posture. So at the beginning of a journey, we decide to forgive somebody, but that forgiveness journey can add up over time. In fact, if you've ever experienced a deep, deep wound at another person's hand, you know that sometimes forgiveness has to get revisited whenever there are pivotal moments in your life. I know as Kelly and I have experienced some wounding at the hands of a church that we were a part of, it felt like every single time we marked a milestone, or every single time we went back to that city, we had to re-engage forgiveness again to be able to say oh yeah, that still stings, or oh yeah, something was stolen from us in that moment. And when our youngest kid started high school, and we remember how great the high school ministry was in that place, and now we know that she didn't get to be a part of it. That's we forgive again. Or when we see the face of or an online post or an image of somebody who is actively involved in decisions that harmed us at a core level, we're like, oh, that did happen. And oh, there was loss that was involved in that. And yes, it's time for us to forgive again. And so Jesus tells us really moving parable. He goes, "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants." When we read this story in a group, one of the participants, Gerard, says, it's fascinating that the very beginning of the story indicates the desire for not justice, but the desire for reconciliation, the desire for restoration. He goes, the posture for the king right out of the gate is to settle accounts. And somebody in the group said, it seems like we really only have 2 options when it comes to forgiveness. We can be the kind of people who want to settle accounts and move towards restoration, or people who want to settle scores and move towards vengeance. But there really isn't any middle ground. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. So I did a little Bible math. I can explain it to you more in detail if you care, but that number is roughly about $16 billion. So we don't think that this is like a personal loan. It's likely that the servant who owes him money is a cabinet official who made some kind of deal with another foreign government that went horribly south and cost the kingdom an absurd amount of money. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. And at this, the servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." And the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. Again, if we're going to use the same formula that I was using for Bible math, it's about $20,000. It's not nothing, but it's a debt that could be paid off given grace and time. And he grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. And his fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." If that line sounds familiar, it's because it's the very same line that the first servant used to the king. But that servant refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. When I read this line, I'm kind of haunted by what the unmerciful servant does. He grabs his colleague and begins to choke him. And one of the participants who was at this retreat says that she had worked at a hospital, and they often interface with people who are victims of domestic violence. And they say that choking as an assault is intensely personal. And when I read this story, I'm reminded that when I refuse to forgive somebody else, I'm committing an act of spiritual violence. I'm choking spiritual life and connection out of that equation. And it's a reminder to me of how harmful, how brutal unforgiveness really is at both a spiritual and a relational level. And then he says this, he goes, "Pay back what you owe me." And whenever I'm struggling with unforgiveness, I'm going to a person, I'm like, you have to give back what you took. You have to undo what you did. You have to restore what you stole. The more I replay that story in my mind, that pay back what you owe me, I'm realizing that many of the people that I want to fix things that they have done, they're physically incapable of doing so. That water is already under the bridge. That ship has already sailed. That damage has already been done. And even if they wanted to, that person doesn't have the ability or the power to pay back everything that their offense cost me. Here's what else is fascinating about that. It says that when the unmerciful servant had his colleague thrown into prison, it says the other servants saw what had happened and they were outraged. Many times when I'm struggling with unforgiveness, I like to try to convince myself that the only people who are affected by my unforgiveness are me and the party who did me wrong. But the truth is, rage will always overflow its banks in our lives. It's like a river that once it gets to flood stage is just going to go wherever it wants to go, regardless of where we want it to go. And one of the hard lessons I've learned about forgiveness in my life these days is, as much as I like to think that I can hold rage for one person in one corner of my life and love for other people in the other area of my life, it just simply isn't humanly possible. Why? Bitterness anywhere is a threat to love everywhere. Like, if I am holding the poison of bitterness in any portion of my soul, it is a threat that can poison my desire to operate in love everywhere else. I mean, we get into other scriptures, especially in 1 John, that says if we say that we love God and we hate our brother, we're liars. So I can't hate a person and love other people to the full extent that I want to. Because if I'm holding hate in any corner of my heart, that is dripping into the groundwater. And I can't love the way that I want to. So not only is unforgiveness an act of spiritual violence, but unforgiveness is a threat to the relationships that I care about, even when it's a risk to the relationships that I don't have energy for anymore. The story ends like this. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" And in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Now, if Jesus is telling a parable about the kingdom and the king represents God the Father, then the unmerciful servant is being handed over to be tortured, which is an image that I really struggle with. But the more I've reflected on it, the more I wonder if this is a plausible theory for this passage. Maybe unforgiveness, maybe harboring bitterness, maybe that's its own punishment. I mean, if you've ever held on to resentment for longer than you should have, you know that it comes with a price. Comes with a price for our mental health, our emotional health, our physical health. We know that people who struggle with anger chronically have higher rates of heart disease and blood pressure and chronic stress. And maybe what they're trying to say is if we choose to live in the prison of bitterness, then resentment is its own torture. And when I read this verse, I start to recall what Jesus prayed in the Lord's Prayer, which is, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And I want to just keep coming back to that two-letter word, as. It might be the most loaded word in the Lord's Prayer. And Jesus is saying we can only receive mercy to the extent that we have extended it and are willing to extend it. It cannot only be a one-way street. We can't be people who are forgiven by God and then refuse to forgive others. That's not how it works. And the parable of the unmerciful servant reminds us that somebody who wants to receive forgiveness and not forgive others is somebody who doesn't understand the depth at which they have been forgiven in the first place. In fact, when the first servant says, he's like, hey, I'll pay it back. Those are empty words. He couldn't pay it back in 100 lifetimes. That's how great the debt is. And I have to remind myself that no matter what I think others have done to me, my offenses against God are very real. And my sin, my rebellion, my disobedience runs deeper than I want to think that it does. And if I take a moral inventory of my own life, and one of the exercises that we did on this retreat is, would you pause to consider not just who you need to forgive, but would you pause to consider who you need to request forgiveness from? And there's one person in my life that popped immediately to mind that I had harmed not once, but twice in ways that were deeply painful to them. And just the guilt and the conviction of that welled up in me in such a way that was really overwhelming. And I believe that God is inviting us to walk a path of forgiveness, not seasonally, but daily. And it was important enough for Jesus to be able to give his disciples this prayer script that says, like, when you pray, make sure that you pray these two lines all the time. Father, forgive me, and Father, give me the grace to forgive others. And when we do that, we become the kind of people who are kind of walking billboards for the kindness and the compassion of God that this world so desperately needs to hear. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.